Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Analyst, ONTABA's podcast made right here in Ontario for Ontario behavior analysts. In today's episode, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Shane Spiker, who is a BCBAD in Ormond Beach, Florida. Shane received his Master's of Science of Psychology in 2012 and his second Master's of Science in Applied Psychology in 2016. In May 2019, he graduated with his PhD in Clinical Psychology with a concentration on instructional design. He has been providing services in the field of ABA since 2010, with the majority of his experience with autistic learners and other disabilities. Shane specializes in working with teens and adults with dangerous problem behavior, sexual behavior, and medically complex individuals in the home and community-based setting. Primarily, Shane serves as the Clinical Training and Safety Director at PBS Corp. Shane previously served as the Vice President of the Sexual Behavior Research and Practice SIG through ABAI, and he has authored several articles and text chapters related to ethics and behavior analysis and practice. He is the author of several books, including Anxiety Report, Take Care, Understanding Risk-Benefit Analysis, and the Behavior Foundations. Currently, he is also serving as an instructor at Florida Institute of Technology, Arizona State University, and Regis College, where he teaches graduate-level coursework. He enjoys reading and appreciates a really good cup of coffee. And he's been a longtime friend of ONTABA. Welcome, Shane.
Hey, thanks for having me. I was going to say, I think I'm an honorary ONTABA at this point in time. Yeah. And my favorite thing to do now is that anytime I know that you and I are working together on anything, I'm just going to make my bio a little bit longer to make it a little bit more uncomfortable for both of us.
That sounds about right. Sounds about right.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, man. This is great. I'm super stoked.
I'm super excited to have this chat with you. I think it's a really important topic that a lot of folks are starting to key in on. So I'm excited to kind of help people expand their knowledge on that today. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, for sure. I'm in total agreement. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about. I mean, obviously, because I'm talking about it everywhere, but it's good stuff. Yeah.
So to get us kicked off in 2025, you were one of our keynotes at ONTABACon, and you actually talked about this topic. You talked about sexuality. Can you remind us why you're so passionate about work in ABA and sexuality?
So I love this question because I think that because on the surface, when you hear somebody wanting to talk about sex and sexuality and stuff, you probably come with some biases and whatnot. I was not passionate about this. This was something I accidentally fell into. For those of you who have ever heard me kind of talk about my history in behavior analysis, this was a complete accident. Like 3 of the first 6 clients I worked with had some kind of dangerous or inappropriate sexual behavior that was going on, and we had no competence. So, the reason I kind of talk about this a lot is because what I've noticed is that many times this gets ignored. And it has 2 effects, right? It has the one effect is that many of our learners that never get access to sex ed are put at greater risk as a result of not knowing how to engage in safe sex, maybe having opportunities to engage with body autonomy. There's lots of things that kind of come up from it. So there's the risk part of it, but there's also like the quality of life part of it, which is just people deserve an opportunity to engage in pleasure-seeking behaviors and in behaviors that are going to improve their quality of life. The learners that we work with deserve opportunities to try to have families if they want to have children, whatever it is, right? And so I think there's 2 sides of it. It's the avoid risk and work towards a higher quality of life.
I think that's such a good and important point because there's lots of data that shows us that people with developmental disabilities are at a greater risk for abuse, right? Mm-hmm. So the lack of sex ed further increases that, but also too is that perception that people with disabilities are automatically asexual and won't,
right?
Just because they don't understand what sexuality is, they don't have the need for or the hormones to kick off sexual behavior. So it's really great to see people like you taking this on and helping folks live that life. I think as you were kind of sharing that in my head, I was like, if somebody would ever rewrite a paper like the donuts paper about masturbation and sex, it would be super fitting, right? Because everybody does have that right to seek those pleasurable behaviors that we all enjoy, or most of us enjoy anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And I think that it's a touchy subject, right? I mean,
Mhm.
like it's one of those things that I just think people really, they don't think of it like that. They think of it as we always kind of talk about myth busting in this space, and and a lot of that is most of my work in this is just doing myth busting and just doing education. It's like, no, that's not going to happen. No, they're not going to grow hair on their palms. No, they're not going to go blind. All the old, like, the myths that you would hear, or at least you hear in the United States. I don't know if that I don't know if that those myths have carried over into Canada, but like those are what we would hear when we were kids. Like, you're gonna go blind if you do that too much. It's like, I mean, my parents never said that, but somebody in my circle did at one point,
Yeah.
So a lot of what we're doing is myth busting. It's just because it's people just don't know.
Yeah.
They're afraid of it.
Yeah, they're definitely up here, and I think that myth busting is super important, and I think part of that myth busting has carried over to some professionals, but there are also other kind of reasons why people might be hesitant. So when it comes to working in the field of sexuality, why do you think ABA clinicians are reluctant to target these sexuality skills?
Oh, I think that there are multiple systems at play here. I mean, ultimately, it comes down to learning histories, right? Like
Mhm.
that's what it always is. Is everybody's got a unique learning history with sex and sexuality and all this stuff. But I do think that ABA clinicians in general are. I think you've got kind of a more acute problem, which is scope of competence.
Yeah.
And then you've got a lager, kind of more macro problem, which is culture, right?
Hmm.
So, like inside of the scope of competence piece, no behavior analytic training program is really doing this, at least at the graduate level, right? You're probably doing this like post certification and stuff like this, but nobody's doing training in this. We are not talking about. I mean, I'm starting to see programs. I teach in a couple programs where that is a topic of interest in one of the modules, but as a subset or a subfield. And so we are not trained to competence in this area
Hmm.
unless we're getting outside training, interdisciplinary training, stuff like that. So I think that's one thing. And I wish I am. This is a wish list thing for me for the field in general. I wish people would take that caution and apply it to every other place that they're not competent in. Like, you won't do this here, but you'll do this in other places. Oh, you just picked up a VB map today, and then you're just going to go run a VB map. Great, that's beautiful. Like, what that it's the same. It's the same
Yeah.
problem, right? So I ultimately think that that's one of the things. Is like, I think that this topic in general, with everybody's learning histories, is a competence issue, but I do think that there's a larger cultural piece. I'll speak more to kind of where the region that I live in, and I live in south of the United States. So when people hear about the South and the Bible Belt and all that stuff, you see those scary preachers in movies and stuff like that. They all live here where I'm at, and there's a culture around. At least in the United States, I'll say, there's a very, it started as a Puritan country,
Hmm.
like in terms of like when it was colonized, to be clear. And so because we were not as like, the United States was not quite as reticent to talk about this before white folks showed up. And so, when the settlers came here, when they started colonizing, they came here because they wanted, people talk about they came here because they wanted religious freedom. They wanted less religious freedom. They wanted it to be more conservative and more strict. They were kicked out of England. They didn't come
Yeah.
here on their own volition. They were removed because they were too conservative. So there is a culture here, at least in the United States, that we have to look at from a cultural selection standpoint, where we don't talk about sex. People are afraid of it. There's a lot of myth. There's a lot of misinformation. So I think those two things together contribute to behavior analytic practitioners just not wanting to deal with this, or like just like address it head on.
And that's an interesting kind of thought, right? That it comes from this cultural shift where sex is taboo and sexuality is taboo. And I think that has led for people to think that sex ed or sexuality or teaching within that domain of sexuality is only about masturbation or only about intercourse or only about
Right.
dating. But sexuality is so far beyond that, right? It's not limited to those three acts. When you think about sex ed, what sort of domains, what sort of skills would you start to target from an early age? From the younger age.
Yeah. So I love this question because I think this is like one of the spaces that it's really easy to debunk misinformation, right? Sex education is not about teaching sex. It is about things like body autonomy. It's about accurate medical reporting. It's about reproductive health. It's about interpersonal violence and preventing domestic abuse and domestic violence. It's about all these things. I mean, to me, the first thing I think of, truly the first thing I think of when I think of sex education is stuff like body autonomy, consent, assent, and boundaries, right? And I think about this, and I've thought about this a lot because, you know, I have grown up in my family with, there's always been like kids, like little kids in the family. And, you know, the one thing that you always hear about is like the aunt or the uncle or the grandparent that comes over that's like, give me a hug. And the kid's like, no. And then the family members are like, no, give him the hug, blah, blah, blah. And like, you know, it seems innocent and da 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 da. But you know, I have a niece right now who is she is absolutely ridiculous. And every time I see her, I'm like, "Are you gonna give me a hug?" And she goes, "Tomorrow." And I'm like, "Oh, it's always tomorrow," you know, joke. And that's like the joke that we have. But I never go, "I'm gonna get a hug anyway."
Yeah,
you know, because body autonomy and consent and assent and those boundaries, I think is so valuable. I honestly think that skill and being able to label body parts are two of the most critical sex ed skills that people need to learn, and that is the start. That, I mean, that's the very beginning for in sex ed, is like teaching those things, and then everything else blossoms from there.
and I think like that's such an important point to talk about, like body autonomy and consent and assent, because I think that also trickles into the rest of the work that we do, right? Like if we
Yes.
have to do hand over hand prompting, but we see a learner resisting, we need to be able to adapt to that because they're removing assent, and we need to teach them that, like, hey, if you don't like to be touched in a specific way, you deserve to be listened to. How would
Yes.
you go about kind of helping develop that with clinicians? What would be your advice to supervisors out there who are trying to build that with their staff?
So I love to put people in situations and do like practical role play situations.
Hmm.
And really, and you know, in those situations, when I say that, of course, if I'm ever in a situation, because I do a lot of crisis training too, if I'm in a situation where I have to demonstrate a skill and I need to touch somebody, I always ask permission to go, can I demonstrate this? And they're like, yeah, sure. You know, I've never had anybody go, absolutely not, you know, but like, it's one of those things where if somebody did, I was like, okay, well, would somebody volunteer so I can demonstrate the
Yeah.
skill? And so a lot of it's kind of putting people in that position, like, you know, thinking about, you know, because I think you could educate a lot. You can go, oh, the minute you do it hand over hand, that person's nervous system is going to be fired up. Like there's lots of other things that happen beyond behavior analytics scope that we need to know
Hmm.
about. So I could tell you about that all day and you could understand that all day, or I can have you do a thought experiment or put you in a situation where you are in this and feel what it's like. We used to do a verbal behavior program at a group home I worked at, because the group home that we worked in just was like, they don't need devices, da 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 da. They can communicate, they can do this. And I was like, okay, so let's do this. We're going to do an experiment. Here's some masking tape. I would like everybody to put masking tape over your mouth. You're not going to speak at all. No words, nothing at all. Like, this is what we're going to do. And then I want you to solve this complex problem by communicating with everybody else, but not writing and not talking.
Hmm.
And they go, okay. So now this is, so a lot of it's kind of like that, is putting them in a situation where they actually get to maybe empathize with the situation and the person that they're working with, so that they can really see this is what it's like. That's what it's like when somebody grabs your hand and makes you do this thing and you're trying to resist.
And I think bringing it back to the kind of experience for folks is really important because a lot of us don't have that experience, right? Like, I
Yeah,
mean, I know what it's like to be in a place where you don't understand anybody and nobody understands you. Because when I came to Canada, I didn't know any English, right? But a lot of people won't. I mean, I spoke, I just didn't speak their language. A lot of
sure.
other folks may not have that. So I like that idea of in the middle of training, kind of putting them in positions or simulating positions where their learners would be as part of the training. I think that's a really important point. Another thing that I was thinking about while you were talking about body autonomy and stuff was um, teaching a skill as simple as like closing the door when you go to the bathroom, right?
Yeah.
For a lot, when our clients typically start ABA, they're little, they're 2, 3, and it's typical to have an adult supporting you, right? But then they become 8, 9, 10, 15, 23, and that was never faded out. And you're like, how would clinicians, in your opinion, be better fitting to fading that out and creating a little bit more independence, even if total independence is impossible, but at least, you know, attaining that privacy and closing the door and building those skills? How could we go about doing that?
Well, I think, I think with any behavior analytic thing, it's really important to think about why that happens, like where those skills come from, right? So like, I think about this a lot with, something like people using urinals in restrooms, and I mean, like when you think about like, I think okay, let me start by saying this. I think a lot of the problem is when you have early learners, you're like, oh my God, they're so cute, they're so fun, and you're like, there's this piece where you kind of go, any behavior they engage in is cute no matter what, and then also because they're younger and maybe unsafe without supervision, you always want to keep an eye on them. So like you just automatically go, well, I'm not going to close the door because they're unsafe. And that's often a justification that I hear in general. But think about I want to go back to this example with the bathroom door open. And I want to think about this, right? Like where could that possibly come from? I think of this from the perspective of you've got a single parent who has a young child, who that young child is in all kinds of situations, like they're climbing on stuff, they're learning to walk, they're learning to, but the single parent has to use the restroom at some point. So what do? They go to the bathroom and they leave the door open to keep an eye on their kid. It's modeled for them from the beginning. So like, I think it's valuable to take a step back and go, well, where did this behavior actually start and come from, and kind of work backwards from there. And when you're working with caregivers and staff, you're having those conversations. Well, this is why we did this before. There is a functional reason why this happened. This is no longer functional. So now we got to start shaping and fading, right? I mean, and going back to just good shaping procedures. Like you may not be able to close a door immediately that first time or teach them to do that. Like, but you might start the prompt, or you might fade that in if you are helping somebody toilet through a program and they can. So it's a lot of like figuring out what is the actual problem. Can this person do this? Do I need to shape this up? Is there a safety issue? There's a lot of questions to answer inside of that, but I always kind of start with think about where you're at and shape from there. And if you can't do that, then you need to review some of your behavior analytic materials,
Yeah, definitely. And I think shaping is one of the hardest skills. And especially when you're shaping a behavior that isn't standardized, that isn't task analyzed, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
but I think the other side, you're right. Shaping is hard, but like I think Andrew Bulla says this great. He's like, if you can't go, you should go. Everybody should go work with animals at some point in time, because you have to be able to shape and not do hand over hand, especially because he does work with like gray wolves and like stuff. And so he's like, he's teaching wolves, and he's like, you don't have to use language to shape behavior. And I think that's honestly a lost skill for a lot of clinicians right now.
Definitely. I definitely agree. And there's some potential over reliance on specific prompts that are harder to fade. So I think that's some great advice. And we kind of touched on this a little bit. But I think, as behavior analysts, we all want our clients to be set up for success later in life. We want to build as much independence as possible. In terms of setting people up for success in sexuality or sexual safety, what target behaviors would you recommend clinicians start to think about focusing on? And how early would you recommend that starts?
Yeah. So there are a lot of views on this across the sex educator world and all this. I think a lot of it depends on, I think a lot of it requires you to understand that sex education starts from the very beginning. Like it starts from day one, right? And the reason being is that something as simple as language could be the difference between somebody being abused and being protected. So to me, the first things I think are labeling your body parts and using accurate terms, right? I think honoring no when somebody is trying to touch you or do anything. I think that's the other one. I think honestly, those are the two most important. And I think you do that as soon as somebody can start speaking. And even before that, right? Like being able to like have somebody even tact or point at their body parts when you're labeling them, right? And there's so many, because you might hear that and think that that's not maybe a sex ed skill, but those skills regardless are generalizable, right? If I have to go to a medical appointment, I have to report that my head hurts, but I can't speak, or like I mean, how many of us have been to the doctor and like we've lost our voice because we've got a sore throat, or we can't, and we have to point and report and write and stuff like that. So being able to label body parts, especially from like a medical space, is so critical. So I think that's the first one. It's like being able to just simply label body parts, and then being able to say no and have that honored by people that are caring for you. And I think that starts early. I mean, I think that starts like year one, day one. I mean, I think that starts early.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good point for us to be able to, to teach the skills of, this is the basics. This is my nose, my eyes, but also this is my penis. This is or my vagina or my vulva, for those types of reports, for safety reports, right?
Yeah.
And I think another aspect of sexuality that that we talk about often, but we don't often kind of break down into skills that build up to this is consent.
Yes.
Right? So, and there's two sides of consent. One is giving consent, and the other one is receiving consent. When it comes to receiving consent, what sort of skills do you think we need to teach from a really early age so that individuals who will grow up to have partners, or who may grow up to have partners, successfully receive consent from their partner?
I love this. I love this one. So there's two resources and a thing that I'll say. Okay. So one, there's a great article from the Louisiana Contextual Behavioral Science Group, and it's on radical consent and understanding conceptually what radical consent is. So number one resource, check it out. I mean, I'll make sure if you ever read, it's a great, it's called Beyond No Means No, and it's a publicly available article. The other one is the T video, and I'm sure every sex educator that has ever listened to like hears it, they're like, oh god, the T video. But the T video is really good. It's because it explains that consent and receiving consent is a continuous process, right? So it's not just I got a yes and it's a flat yes forever. It's yes right now, but there's going to be a point where I drink half the tea and I go, you know what? I don't really want tea anymore. Or I want tea, but I want tea with sugar and milk, or I want whatever it is. Like you vary it, like and could understand that consent evolves in a situation too. So I think that those more complex skills of observing, communicating, responding to stimuli in the environment, I think all of those are necessary. There's a great researcher that I want to shout out. Her name is Marlisha Bell, Dr. Marlisha Bell, and she has done some work on consent and teaching young learners consent skills. I think that was her dissertation, and she's done some really cool work around that. So if you ever get a chance to check her work out, she's incredible for this. But that's really where it starts, is like understanding that like receiving a yes is not a permanent yes. And so there's skills around tolerating no, accepting no, a tolerance response, going, that's fine, responding without coercion, going, oh, but you said you were going to do this, and now you're going to stop, like, you're going to take that back. That seems unfair. But what about, like, those are all coercive statements. So understanding those skills is understanding what's a coercive statement, understanding how consent evolves, like all of those. And it's complex, right? It's so complex, but it's so necessary. And I think that's what it is language and accepting no, and accepting and being able to observe consent evolve in those conversations.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you touched on tolerance to denial and tolerance to even delay, maybe.
Yes.
Because maybe it's not a no forever. Maybe it's a like, not right now. There's people here, right? Or not right now. I need to, whatever. So I'm so glad that you touched on that tolerance piece, because there's been a few instances where clients are like, they said no, and I felt like I couldn't stop myself, and it was urges took over.
Yeah, your urges. You hear that a lot. Yeah.
So that.
Yeah, I mean, there was a story that I'd heard. Somebody was working with an adult learner who had a foot fetish, and they taught them to receive consent, which was they were going to ask people to see their feet, and then they didn't do anything like majorly inappropriate, but they would like ask to see their feet to strangers and and I say inappropriate, like that's always a touchy term, like but But before, he would just walk up and like try to grab somebody's shoe and take their shoe off. So they taught him to ask consent. He did that really great. One day he walks up to a stranger while he's by himself. He does not have a supervisor to work with him or somebody monitoring him. He asks this woman to see her feet. She says no. He grabs her shoe anyway because he did ask for consent. He did all the right things to ask for consent. He just didn't tolerate it, and he ended up getting arrested because he assaulted her. So, you know, it's one of those things where you have to take it to the level beyond. It goes, yes, I can teach consent. I also have to teach this person to respond to no appropriately and safely.
And I think, again, like that is such an important part of consent. Another kind of important part of consent that you kind of touched on, which is that it's an ongoing process. But within that ongoing process, I think something that's really hard for a lot of our clients is also reading the way the yes is being said.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because it could be like an excited yes, which is what you want, or like I'm not feeling safe, but the safest thing to do right now is say yes, or this is what I've been taught to do, the process. How would you teach a client to go through that, like reading body language to a yes piece?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is teaching the complexities of understanding the circumstances too. It's not just a body language, right? Because people can be really nervous about it, and they could want to, and they want to communicate, and they want to say yes, but they're just nervous. I mean, I'm nervous. And I get really like self-conscious about this stuff too. So I think a really good example, I know you and I have talked about this before. Y'all don't have It's Always Sunny, the show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia up there, or you do, and like maybe you never watched it, but there is an ongoing joke. One of the characters is kind of like a creep, and he talks about how he only asks for consent when he is on a boat with a woman in the middle of like a lake or in a body of water. And he's like, they always say yes because of the implication. And you're like, that's dark. It's a dark joke, right? But I mean, that is a perfect example of going, yeah, of course she said yes, because this is the safest thing that she could have said, unfortunately, right? And so when I work with learners, it's like, you know, sometimes it's, oh, you said yes, are you sure? Or like, it's not, I think something that people think is like, sometimes consent is like an explicit, like it's got to be just yes, right? And just yes is the only acceptable thing. And that is accepted, and it should be there. But there's other phrases like you could ask, you check in, how are you feeling? Are you still feeling okay? Like, you know, it's a lot of it's just kind of like communication and just verification. It doesn't necessarily have to be that they're picking up body language. It could also be just that they're doing ongoing communication and stuff like that too. So I think there's like, it's just a nuanced skill. I think picking up body language is difficult. And I want to point out too, I think that this skill is difficult for everybody.
Yeah.
For everybody, not just our learners. You know, I've lots of people in my life, and like the joke is always kind of like I'm oblivious to everything, like to body language stuff. I'm completely oblivious, and I would be a perfect candidate for learning how to read body language and stuff like that. I'm just kind of like, I just go about my day like, yeah, sure, okay, yeah. They were just very nice to me, you know. It's like, no, that's not what they were doing, and but I think that's the thing. It's like I'm probably not the best person to teach body language. But body language is not the only indicator too. I think that you can kind of get past that with that confirmation language.
And I think that's a really good point, you know, when you're talking about like the nerves, because somebody may be interested in trying something with a partner or with somebody else, but maybe unsure. And all they would need in that moment is a supportive partner who's willing to teach. And those are the really complex skills. And I think that may be part of why behavior analysts are kind of, you know, holding back on teaching. What would be your recommendation for a behavior analyst that's there, that's willing to teach, but is kind of worried about the complexity of these skills?
So yeah, I think this comes from a place where you have to just build your skills. You have to get comfortable talking about this stuff. I think that with more knowledge, I think you get better, and I think that you get better at teaching this stuff. But I do think that like one of the things I always recommend is outside resources. I will tell you there are two communities that I have learned more about sex education than any other sex. It's just from like studying and like talking to people from the communities, and that is like anime convention folks, like people that run anime conventions and like nerd conventions and stuff like that. I say nerd conventions lovingly because I go to MegaCon and all stuff all the time. But like some of the language around consent and body autonomy and stuff like that it's so clear and concise and so protective. It's like one of those things where you go, oh, I'm learning a lot about how people communicate about this. And another one is the BDSM community. With around how people talk about like how they are really clear, they're really concise about their language. They set expectations when people are nervous. The supportive partners, there's an agreement there, and so those two communities can teach us a lot about how people can communicate about this stuff and not lose the passion or desire or the motivation or any of those things. So I think a lot of it's just being able to get exposure to some of this stuff. And I'm not saying that you need to go and like watch a bunch of porn and be like, now I know about sex, because that's also not helpful, right? Like you have to have porn literacy, which is its own skill. So I think a lot of it is just exposure. It's getting more exposure to the content, dispelling those myths, breaking down your fears so that you can talk about this in a more succinct and safe way. I mean, I had to do that. It took a long time for me to do that, but that's what I did is I just read a lot of books. So like I'll be on a plane reading a book that's like sex, maybe it's not for you, and it's like a big, and I have to like learn to be okay with reading stuff like that so that I can do better for my clients,
And that part where it's like removing the taboo out of sexuality, although it's not our job to do it for society, I think it should be our job to do it within our teams and within our clients.
Yeah.
Because if we're not comfortable talking about it, why would anybody else be, right?
Right. And also just understanding, I think that, for me, I think that some people think that when you get into the clinical aspects of this, it kind of like diminishes the magic of it too. And ultimately that's just not what happens, right? Like I think that you can be clinical and understand it. And also that I think that makes you better equipped to have these conversations and also support people and also make it less taboo and also do all those things, right? And everybody's got a personal journey through that as their learning histories go. And so I think that that's important to just give yourself grace as you explore it. But it takes some time, and I'm certainly not at some self-actualized sexual education peak by any means, but I do think that is one of those things as time goes on, you just kind of learn to, you learn to get more comfortable with it and understand, like, if you can take some of the mysticism away from it and take some of the big scariness of it, like it's biological, it's medical, it's social. Like if you think of it from those domains, sexuality is not just sex, it's all those other things that are equally as important. So that can kind of like maybe break down some of those walls too.
Yeah. And it does play, when we talk about developing the skills, we always talk about like developing the skills to improve quality of life. And sexuality has a big part into the human quality of life. Not everybody is sexual, obviously. There are loads of folks who are asexual or not interested in sex at all. But for the majority of folks who are, it plays a big role, right? So when we're taking that into account, I think it's really important.
Yeah, for absolutely 100%.
And for clinicians who are wanting to start this or want an idea on any skills that may be missing, are there any assessments that you would recommend that highlight kind of sexuality skills and sex safety skills that we can start working on?
Yeah. So I'm going to start off by saying that this is a scope of competency question more than anything, because you have to be competent in the assessments to do this. I keep hearing Nicholas Smile Aether in the back of my head because if you're not familiar with his work is really great and really interesting, and he talks about this idea of like not just diving into an assessment to do it, but if you want to explore gaining competency in some of these areas, there are a couple that are kind of outside of the behavior analytics scope that I think are really useful. The Talk SC, which is it's an assessment that tests knowledge. It's an indirect assessment, but it's a tool that allows you to explore somebody's knowledge around certain topics, and so that is really cool and really interesting to see. We're running that. I'm running that with a group right now. I'm doing a consultative model, and we're doing that with that group. And it's really cool because I got to walk through one of these with the clinician, and they were able to take the results from it and confirm based on the behavior problems, like, oh yeah, this makes sense because this gap in knowledge applies directly to this problem behavior that we're seeing. So we can kind of see that, which is really, really neat. And it's just an interview. There's also the Armadillo, which is a risk assessment for sex offenders. There is the SCAT-R, which is a really cool one too. And so those ones are just worth checking out. The Static 99 is another one too that's really cool. Some of them are psychometrically developed, so like it's important that you know that this might be outside of the scope of behavior analysis in general. But if you're a sex educator or you're working in the sexual space, like it's good to have those in your back pocket if you need to. So those are what I would start. But we've got literature that shows that our assessment tools work for at least the observable sexual behaviors that occur. We've got social skills assessments. We have got the AFLs and the ABLs that have some social skills components to it, tacting, all that stuff that are related to sex education. There is, I've seen functional analyses done for some of these behaviors. Now, behavior analysis is limited in its scope and what we treat, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this. But as far as assessments go, we can apply our assessment tools to these types of behaviors, and we can use those standard tools that you're already comfortable with. Yeah, I'm not saying go do that, get supervision and mentorship, but you can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it always goes back to before you do it, make sure you know what you're doing, right?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. The broadhead, go do the broadhead competency scope of competence assessment. He's got that tool and that scope of competence paper that he does. And it's a nice little thing. It's a self-assessment where you go, oh yeah, no, I'm not competent in this. I'll go get some supervision.
There you go. We'll put that in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
And you talked a little bit earlier about like the scope of competence of behavior analysts and the tools that we can use that are already in our toolkit to assess or to build these skills. And when it comes to our interventions, obviously we want our interventions to be successful, and the success needs to be carried out outside of where we're teaching it, right?
Sure.
Because obviously we're not going to be in sexual settings with our clients.
Yeah.
How can you plan? Well, hopefully, right?
Hopefully, yeah. Ideally, you will not be. Ethically, you should not be. Legally, right. You definitely will not be, right?
Absolutely. When it comes to teaching for generalization, and generalization can often be hard for some of our clients, how can we support that? How can we make sure that the skills we are teaching transfer to the settings where they need to be used?
That is such a great question. I know you and I have had this conversation specifically because of some of the work that you're doing too. And you're just kind of like, yeah, you can only take somebody so far.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's always the challenge. So I think, generalization is a really good way to go about this, where you're thinking about varying the language, varying the circumstances. I mean, when it comes to let's just talk about the skill of dating, not even sex. Let's talk about dating and how complex that is, because you have to have skills to be able to date. You have to have financial skills because you're paying for the date. You have to have reciprocal conversations. You have to be able to know how to order at a restaurant. Like there's lots of skills that happen inside of there. So I think that when we talk about generalization, it's not just about the skill itself. It's all about the skill in relation to those other skills and those other contingencies, and linking them and relating them and making sure that you're not like, not doing sequential modification where all you're doing is you're working on one skill and building it out to a certain level and then go and moving on to the next skill. I think there's lots of ways to kind of shape and mold and use. I think honestly, as far as interventions go, natural environment teaching is the best way to go with some of this stuff, with the understanding that you are going to be working on larger programs, at least in a dating situation. But I think that honestly, the mistake that I see a lot of clinicians make more than anything when it comes to interventions and selecting interventions is function-based. Yeah. Everybody thinks that the minute that you see a sexual behavior, that it is sexual, and that's the function, which, by the way, is not one of the 4 general functions that we talk about. Automatic positive reinforcement is probably more in that world, is what you're thinking, right? Or self-stimulation. But the majority of our literature has shown that self-stimulation is not the reason that inappropriate or dangerous or public sexual behavior is even happening. It's escape from algebra. Yeah. it's attention. So I think before you even get to the generalization piece, because I think that you're naturally going to account for that to some level. I think where people make the first mistake is assuming the function is always self-stimulatory for any of these behaviors, and it's rarely the case. I mean, it might be muddled in there, but it's not. That's not usually what we've seen, and we have research to demonstrate that's the case too.
And you bringing up that point brings up a point that Landa Fox, shout out to Landa Fox, made at one of her
Love her.
presentations in
Yeah.
BC, which was like in our space, most of our clients are male, right? And
Yeah.
most of the people working with these males are female. And typically, especially when you start working with youth and adults, there are a lot of erections that are happening in sessions.
Everyone's got an
And
erection. It's crazy.
right. And folks immediately start to think like that's sexual behavior because maybe they're touching it or they're moving it or whatever. So they're like they're engaging in sexual behavior. Meanwhile, it could
Hypervigilance.
just be like,
Yeah.
dude, I'm 15. My hormones are going. Erections happen to all males at random times of the day, whether or not they're aroused. And maybe they're just uncomfortable and trying to adjust. So having that thought, and I think that goes back to us talking more about what we're doing, right? More
Yeah.
about sexuality, making it less taboo, so that that education piece presses, like that education piece continues to be brought in for the people that are delivering the services as well as the people that are receiving the services. Are there any other kind of examples of behavior that looks sexual but isn't that you would
Yeah.
like people to be aware of?
Oh man. I'm so glad you brought up erections because I've worked with so many middle schoolers and I'm just like, yeah, like I think about, you know, I'm sure you've thought about this too, but like being in middle school, you're like, all it would take would be like the Pledge of Allegiance. You know, like it's like literally like it's all it takes, and you go, oh no, I can't go to my next class. I need to adjust, or you know. So are there other behaviors? Yeah, I think that any sort of touch, I think sometimes people think touch is automatically a sexual thing, and it's not. I think that we can't assume that it is, at least, you know, and I think that doesn't mean, and I think when people hear that, they're going to be like, well, why should we shouldn't you're saying we shouldn't address it? That's certainly not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is, like, I think that to assume that most behaviors are a function of sexual motivation is dangerous, and I think can create more problems for that person than necessary. So I think that's one of them, is just like general touch, hugs. Like I think those people just tend to think that they have like this like inherently sex motivation type of situation going on. Um, you know, I don't know that there's really a lot more that, because I feel like many times in the spaces that I work in, like erections are so villainized. Because, and I think that it's a medical thing, right?
Yeah.
I think from a societal standpoint, I understand, you know, it's like, yeah, men can be terrible, right? But I do think from that standpoint of like, I think that's people automatically think arousal means this, right? And so, but I do think it's important to understand too that some of those same behaviors that occur in our, you know, in our clients that we work with happen across genders. So that is also really valuable. I think what often happens is the opposite, though. I think that behavior is often deemed as not being related to sex education, and it is. And then we kind of talked about that with dating and getting phone numbers and body autonomy. I think I usually see the opposite of that. I see the extreme of this behavior is dangerous and sexual, and we can't. And then, but then the rest of them are like, why wouldn't you recognize that this is sexual? You know, like there's stuff like that that's really interesting. I think I will say too, I think that the minute somebody expresses an interest for something, like a special interest for something, if it's not age appropriate, people will attribute it to a sexual fetish or a paraphilia. So I've seen that happen a lot, where I work with adults in group homes who are watching children's cartoons and children's shows and stuff like that, and that gets attributed to pedophilia when that's not related at all. It's just like, I mean, I watch Ninja Turtles all the time, and you can't tell me that I've got that I have my own fetish around that. It's just like, I grew up with Ninja Turtles. I like watching Ninja Turtles. I'm entertained by Ninja Turtles, right? So I think that's something that I see a lot, is attributing like content to sexual functions.
And I think you made a really good point of looking into kind of the history of that behavior, unless it's brand new and it started, you know, but historically, a lot of our clients are very routine based and can get kind of stuck in their routines. And something that was comforting when they were going back to the age, right, and now fading out. Something that was really comforting when they were 2 can look really sexual when they're 25, right?
Yeah.
So
I mean, also too, as children of the 90s, if you watch some of the stuff that we watched when we were kids, like you're gonna go, like it was the tones were overt.
Yeah.
And there were lots of really problematic things. So, like, I don't know. It's just funny to think that like people get real hung up on that. Like, who wouldn't want to watch a childhood movie that you enjoyed when you were a kid, or read books, or listen to music that you listened to when you were a kid? Like, those
Absolutely.
are special times. But like, so why would we hold a higher standard for our learners?
And I think that right there is an important point to make. That we should kind of position ourselves where they are first, and give them the same kind of leeway or the same respect that we would give to any other person who was engaging in, collecting Yu-Gi-Oh cards or Pokemon cards or sports trading cards in general. When it comes to that, I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Let them have their blue eyes, white dragons.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. A little earlier, you talked about how there's a lot of data and research, and we have a lot of tools. But when it comes to ABA and sex ed specifically, there isn't a lot of research in sex ed in general. I mean, other professions are doing it, but I think when you compare it to other research, it's nowhere near as much availability. Why do you think that lack of research is there?
I mean, I think it's scope of competence, it's comfortability, it's learning histories. I think those are all contributing factors. But I think that there is exactly one reason why we don't have enough research on this, and that is three letters, and it is IRB. Can you imagine? Can you imagine going to an IRB, going, I'm going to teach this person who belongs to under the research banner a protected population. I'm going to walk them through a masturbation procedure. Like, and an IRB going, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead and do that. So I think a lot of it has to do with IRBs and making sure that the folks that are in rightfully so. I want to be clear. I'm not going to villainize IRBs, because
Yeah.
I think that there is something really valuable about ensuring that we protect human participants in any research whatsoever. I mean, we have, at least in the United States, we have and this is actually true around the world, like horrific stories and histories around and across multiple fields, not just behavior analysis, and just with related to human subjects. And so I think that the IRB is a necessary feature of doing human research. And I think that also, because of the amount of protections and barriers that are in place, I think that makes a difference. So, like, for those of you who don't know, they're generally considered, there's 6 protected populations underneath IRB research, at least in the United States. It's prisoners, pregnant people, children, the elderly, people with disabilities, and military folks, right? Those are 6 protected populations underneath human research, at least currently from most IRBs. So most of us are working with teenagers with disabilities. They already check off 2 of the vulnerable populations, the protected populations, and then you add this like arguably risky, we'll say, I think risky is a fair term, risky research question. IRBs are not particularly fond of those. And to be fair, the sexuality research is often, when you get into it, it's oftentimes assessment, it's post-treatment once somebody has been a victim of sexual abuse or something like that. And that's not our field. That's just sexuality in general. There is a lot of research out there kind of exploring and surveying, but you don't find a lot in those populations. And I think, historically speaking, too, one thing that's really interesting is when you go back into like the sexology literature and the sexology research and stuff, many of the subjects were the researchers themselves, like at least allegedly, we'll say. But there was one researcher who like could never get anything approved by an IRB. So he just all of a sudden these like participants started showing up out of the woodwork. They're like, oh, they finally got people. No, we're good. And it just ended up being him in his studies across the board. And so, though that was never like, it was always hypothesized.
Yeah.
But sexuality research is just very difficult to get through an IRB. And I think that's in large part why we don't see a lot of that in our field.
And I mean, I think that's important to have something to protect somebody, like a group to protect folks. But it is obviously creating a little bit of a barrier. So for folks who may be interested in starting to research or starting in the work in general within the area of sexuality, what do you think should be the focus? Where do you think they should get started?
There's so many areas, right? I mean, I think that anybody who's interested in getting into research in general, I think a couple of very easy ones to do, like easy entry points, are things like a discussion paper, a conceptual analysis paper, meta-analyses, scoping reviews, stuff like that. I think those are good places to go. I think those do not require human participants. There are the studies that you're reviewing have already gone through IRBs. So like all you're doing is reviewing existing data, right?
Hmm.
I think you could take that and you can apply that to larger programs, right? You can look at, okay, sex education in the United States. Here's what schools are doing. Here's what this looks like. And then you do like comparative studies where you go, okay, well, we know that this district does abstinence only training. And we also know that the rates of teen pregnancy and STIs are much higher in this district. So you go, I wonder what's happening there. So a lot of it's like, I think I would say that if you're interested in doing research in this area, anything with existing data, a retroactive review of existing data is probably going to be a safe bet because you won't require the same hoops that you would if you were bringing in human participants for treatment. So I think that's usually a good place to start. I think program reviews and retroactive data analyses would be that's the easiest.
And what about folks who are wanting to start working in this space? Not necessarily researching, but developing those skills.
Get supervision and competence. So there's two paths I think that you could go. You could do I kind of say like in-house or like outsource it. So you can in behavior analysis, we've got a couple programs we got one program specifically. Nicholas Mayo Ather is doing that through Empowered, which is a cool program, and that requires extensive training, supervision. There's like a residency part of it, and it's like a post certificate that you can get, which is really cool. And so and it's really thorough. So that's through the Empowered Center and does some cool stuff. It's the CBA or CBS program. And so there's that. I think also it can't hurt to get dual credentialed, like being able to look at additional certifications like, ASECT is probably a good place to go. There's CCAS and CCAN, which are two organizations that offer ongoing training as well. And so that's the US and the Canada. They're like a sex education. They set standards and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So those groups, there is the Sex Education Alliance as well. And I think any of those resources are really great for just contacting new literature and being able to like fold that into your current scope of competence. But I think a lot of it's figuring out to what degree you even want to do this.
Yeah.
Like there are some people that just go, no, I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to work on dating. Like I don't work on social skills because I personally don't have really great social skills, and I'm not the person to teach that, right? And they always kind of say like, those who do not teach or those who do not do teach, right? And I'm like, I can't do either of those things. So there's somebody there who can do that, and I love that there is somebody there who can do that. So I think that's the other side too, is enlisting the folks that have that competence that you don't have, so that you can learn from them and collaborate with them and work alongside them too. But I think dual credential is probably the way to go because the breadth of literature in outside of behavior analysis is absurd.
That's really great advice. And we'll put some of those links and stuff on the show notes for folks to go and peruse at their will. Typically, we close off by asking how ABA can be made more accessible in Ontario, but you're not in Ontario, so you may not know the advice to give. So we'll switch that question to how can behavior analysts make sex ed more accessible for people with disabilities?
Well, to the original question, I was going to say you could put a banner up on the CN Tower. And just be like, here, look at that. Look, this is ABA. So I think that how do we make it more accessible? I think that it starts on a couple different levels. But I think that we have to take time to truly analyze our individual learning histories and the cultural context in which we're talking about this.
Yeah.
I don't think that you're going to get as much buy-in, or you're not going to know what your intervention points are until you know the context in which you're working, right? Like you need to know that. I will say, at least in the United States, you should probably look at the laws and the requirements that go along with how sex education is required or offered. In the United States, there are most states have laws that require that any sex education program has an opt-out. And it also has to have abstinence training as part of it, which is that's pretty consistent. I think almost every state has an abstinence training component to their sex education programs, but we just don't have the resources that cater to our learners sometimes. And so, when you get into fifth grade sex education, it's catered to the general population. It's not catered to our individuals who are not contacting that. So I think a lot of it is looking at the systems of how we provide education, where they get it, and what that even looks like. It's something like 94 or 96% of people with disabilities never even contact sex education in their school programs. So I think, to me, that's where you start. I think that comes down to state and local laws, federal laws, provincial laws. I think you have to look at all that and just kind of evaluate whether or not we're even getting information to people. Then I would look at maybe parent programs, because what we know to be true in a lot of our studies is that parents and caregivers want sex education for their children. They just don't know when to start and who should do it. So I think looking at parent populations and looking at parent groups and looking at what resources already exist, I think is really valuable. And then from a behavior analytics standpoint, I think a lot of it is continuing to have the conversation, is continuing to have honest conversations about our own competencies and our own biases, our own personal values around this, really understanding the statistics around this, because we talk about abuse and we talk about vulnerability. And I think kind of reevaluating our values around this. I think every behavior analyst, or at least the majority of behavior analysts I've ever met, are in this field because they want to help people. And they want to protect people, and they want to do good work for the people, and they want to serve people in a really meaningful way. And but they go, when it comes to sex ed, they go, no, not that far. And I think that ultimately, if you're working in the value of protecting people and making sure they have a good quality of life, this is part of that conversation. So I think we have to continue to have that conversation. And I think those are more nebulous and maybe not as concrete as maybe behavior analysts would like to look at, but I do think that those are places to start, and it may give you some ideas on where to go next.
That's really great advice. Thank you.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, I think just keep talking about it. And I think people will come around and they'll get comfortable, but oh man, it's a lot. It's a lot, and I think, the thing that I kind of always point out too is when you go to like something like a sex ed or the sex behavior research SIG that exists through some organizations, when you look at the consult list, everybody that's on that list specializes, because there's so much to cover, right? There's porn literacy, pleasure seeking, there's kink and fetish, there's just all this stuff inside of this, there's consent and all that stuff. There's just so much that like there's just not enough of us. So get connected with those folks, spend time talking to them, get those certifications, do all that, and I promise you, like, we'll just continue to expand. It's gonna take years and maybe decades, but we'll get there.
And I think that aspect is really important. Like it aligns with our values of keeping folks safe, but also with our values of like expanding the science and kind of creating capacity for that to happen. So those are really good points of advice there.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, I'm just talking off the top of my head. So hopefully it's evergreen, and it's, it's good advice long-term,
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Shane. It was such a great conversation. I definitely learned a lot. Thank you for your time, and we will chat soon.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, man. Thanks for having me. This is good stuff. And feel free to reach out if anybody has any questions or concerns. Feel free to reach out.
Where can people find you?
I am probably most active on Instagram, so at Dr. Shane T. Spiker. But like, feel free to shoot me an email, ST Spiker Behavior without a U at gmail.com. Just for my Canadian folks that are out there. Sorry, we dropped the U.
Thank you so much. We'll put your Instagram and your email in the show notes as well. And again, thank you for your time. And Anytime. We'll chat next time.
Sounds good.